when I was in Santa Ana, I was trained as a 53 pilot, and I was looking forward to flying 53s in Vietnam. I got there. They finally got us to Mag 16. So we checked in, and the admin guy there said, "Hey, we've got more 53 pilots and know what to do with. We're getting ready to send a squadron home. Have you ever flown anything else?" I said, "Well, I went through the Army flight training program, flew Hueys there." He said, "Fine, you're a Huey pilot." They sent me down to HML 167, and all of a sudden I was a Huey pilot. They issued us for survival equipment. Of course, we were issued a pistol, and I think we were issued a shoulder holster and a web belt. And I wore mine all the time on a web belt because you could, with the web belt, you could turn it around your waist and put the gun in front of you so it rested between your legs in the aircraft. Because you had an armored seat, had seat bottoms and sides and back that was 3/8 inch armored steel, and that would stop most rounds. But you were exposed from the front, so most of us flew around with a half a pound of pistol or 4 pounds of pistol or whatever it was, kind of resting in our crotch. We
Yeah,
were
a
also
little,
issued
sure, a little
we were
extra
issued bullet
sensitive.
bouncers. We were
Yeah.
issued ceramic bullet bouncers, and most of us kept the front plate in, but we didn't need the back plate because we had the armored seat behind us. So we took the back plate out and put it down in the chin bubble of the aircraft so it would stop rounds coming that way.
Wow.
So we did some things to try to protect ourselves, and the guys who were there showed me what to do. You could get shot at any time, and it didn't take too long till we got shot at a couple times.
What kinds of different missions did you fly? So I know, medevac would be one. What are the different kinds of missions you might fly, say in the space of a month?
Oh gosh, almost everything. Uh, we had gunships that were assigned as escort for the 46s did most of the medevac. We used the Hueys as gunship escort for them. Um, we also used Huey gunships as escort for resupply missions, recon inserts. Um, we had a quick reaction force assigned 24 hours a day. We had two guns assigned. They had two 46s assigned. If something broke loose somewhere and we had to go, we'd launch that quick reaction force and get out there and take care of whatever was going wrong. The frogs did the dirty work. They hauled the troops. They picked up the medevacs. They hauled the resupply missions out, uh, mostly as external hops, supplies hanging below the aircraft, and then they drop them in a zone. Uh, so anytime there was a troop lift, frogs were used. It wasn't until later, like probably the second half of my tour, that they still started using the 53s for troop lifts and resupply. Initially, the 53s were just used to recover downed aircraft. They uh, they didn't want to send the 53s out because it was a new aircraft to the Marine Corps. It was a very expensive aircraft. It was the most expensive aircraft we've had. So there was some reluctance to use them in a standard mission where they could get shot up.
You did some operations with ROK forces, Republic of Korea forces. And what
Uh-huh.
was your impression of the Korean forces as you observed them?
They their reputation, and I think it was well deserved, was that they were the most vicious fighters out there. They uh, they took no quarter. I mean, they didn't give an inch. The Vietnamese, Viet Cong, the NVA really tried to avoid confrontation with the ROK Marines because there was no survivors.
Hmm.
They didn't take prisoners, and if you did become a prisoner, you didn't want to be interrogated by them.
Did you experience any of that? For example, I've heard, veterans have told me that they would have maybe a ROK officer and some ROK troops on a helo. They would have a couple Viet Cong prisoners, and by the time the flight was over, the Viet Cong prisoners had disappeared from the helo. The rocks had basically
I did not
thrown them out.
experience that firsthand
Okay,
because normally when we were working with the rocks, it would be a gunship escort, and the rocks would be on a frog. Um, so the only firsthand trip I had with them really understanding just how um, disciplined they are is we were hauling a bunch of the troops around. They took them back to Da Nang to the PX, and they did some shopping and stuff. And when we're all done, the crew chief of the 46 had responded that he was missing his camera. And when we told the gunny and the LZ at the Rock headquarters that, hey, we've lost a camera. He said, give me 15 minutes and call me back. So we orbited out away from the area. So about 15 minutes, we called him. He said, come on back and pick up your camera. Uh, I'm pretty sure that whoever
yeah,
light fingered the camera uh, suffered greatly for
right.
his faux pas.
Was there a little bit of tension as you look back? I'm just interested in these rock forces because what you've described is, what I've heard consistently, that they were very tough on each other. Officers could be very
There
tough on the
were,
men.
if
Um,
somebody would screw up, the gunny would beat the sergeant would beat the corporal would beat the lance corporal, and it just got down till the guy who got screwed up, and he took the brunt of the beating because everybody in that chain got
right.
beat.
And then the NVA and the VC will, avoid the rocks because of
Yeah,
their reputation. So on the one hand, and there are things the rocks do that earn them that reputation. So on the one hand, American forces can't do those kinds of things to gain that kind of reputation. At the same time, though, the rocks, seem to be pretty effective. Was there a little tension in that you recall that, gosh, we can't play the way the rocks play, but boy, they sure are effective.
they were effective, and I don't know because we weren't co-located with the ground guys, and the ground guys are the ones who would be more involved in that sort of situation.
Yeah.
Um, so I can't answer for them how they felt about it. I do know that the ground guys were kind of upset with the way we played the war. You
Hmm.
know, we've always taken and held territory, but in Vietnam, we did not take and hold territory. We would have excursions out into the bush. We'd sweep through an area and then we'd pull back. We might stay a day or two and then pull back. And the VC would get out of the tunnels and reappear. It was just like we exchanged ground every 3 days.
So I want to ask you now about the VC and the NVA. Now you're in southern, I believe you're operating in southern I Corps,
We
south
are,
of Da
yes.
Nang.
Yep. We
69.
occasionally went a little north of Da Nang up to the DMZ, but most of our operations were Da Nang and south down to Chu Lai.
And so we're well past Tet, ladder 69 coming into 70. So I'm assuming you're dealing primarily with NVA.
I don't think so. I think we still a lot of VC in there. We uh, we didn't see the uniformed VCA or NVA because they didn't want to come out to the coast. They wanted to work in the mountains and in that area. If they got over towards the coast, they would run into heavy concentrations of Marines, and they didn't want that. They
Mm.
didn't want that conflict.
What after your tour in Vietnam, from the perspective of a Huey pilot, what was your assessment of the adversary, the VC, the NVA? What was your assessment of them as a fighting force?
As fighters, what they didn't. NVA and the VC did not really hold a candle to the Marines and the Army and even the ARVNs that were out there. In a head-to-head conflict, they couldn't do it.
So then what was your own thinking about the VCNVA? I mean, they have weapons and obviously they can hurt you. Um, but it sounds like your assessment of them wasn't that they were a very formidable fighting force, or how would you describe your assessment of them as a fighting force?
Um, when they could get ammunition, they were effective, but their ammunition had to be trucked down the Ho Chi Minh Trail and then brought inland to them. They didn't have a resupply points in
Right.
Vietnam, so but every once in a while they'd come in and they'd fire 8 or 10 rockets onto the base, cause a little disruption. Sometimes they hit something, sometimes they wouldn't. But and after they fired their 8 or 10 rockets, then they'd have to carry them down from Hanoi again.
What was your impression of the ARVN forces?
They were good. They weren't as good as the Koreans, but they were good, especially the Montagnards. When we
Hmm.
worked up north with the Montagnards, they were significantly better than anybody around them.
The
But the
Montagnard.
ARVNs
Yeah.
themselves, as long as they were allowed to work and we supported them, they were good because we gave them a bunch of 30 CH-34s and they were flying around. We did escort missions with them and took them far west to recon stuff. And the ARVNs and the Montagnards, I thought, were excellent.
So when you leave in 70, do you leave, is it November 1970 you leave
I
Vietnam?
left there in end of September,
End of
like
September
September
70.
30th. Yep, yep.
So by that point, Vietnamization is underway. And you've got plenty to think about, so probably you're not spending a whole lot of time contemplating this, but the Vietnamization process is underway. Let's say, the day before you leave Vietnam, a fellow officer asks you whether you're confident that the ARVN forces would be able to, stand up and hold their country once U.S. forces pulled out. At that time, of course, we know how things unfolded, but at that time,
Yeah.
did you feel confident that ARVN forces would be able to hold their country?
No, they needed our support. They couldn't do it by themselves. The ARVNs they would be overwhelmed without our support, without the uh, infrastructure that we made. We had the helicopter units and the artillery units and stuff, and they just didn't have. It was a night medevac mission. I was flying as a co-pilot on the lead ship, and we ended up pulling 80 medevacs off a bridge. We were out there about 5 hours shooting and rearming, and it was kind of funny. The Frog is sitting on a bridge, taking on medevacs, and there's tracers flying about 2, 3, 4 feet in front of the Frog's nose. You see the tracers going by, and the next day they captured a VC who had a little drawing in his pocket that showed how to aim at an aircraft, and it showed him aiming in front of the aircraft. The message in the drawing was that the aircraft was flying and you need to aim in front of him so it would fly the bullets there. But he's aiming at an aircraft sitting on the ground and just spraying bullets like crazy 4 or 5 feet in front of the aircraft. So, that one stuck in my mind. And
Sure.
also in that thing, we first got into that area, uh, there was some mortar fire because the village that we were medevacing from was divided into 4 quadrants by a river that ran east and west and a road that ran north and south. And in the northeast quadrant, when I first got down there was some mortars being fired into the village from this quadrant just outside there. And I happened to roll in. Happened to put a rocket right into the mortar position, and
Wow.
had several secondary explosions from there. And that was kind of exciting. Kind of lit up the night. It got real quiet from that area for a while. But we had the Air Force uh, Spooky, which is then it was a C-117 gunship orbiting on the west side of the village and had 3 or 4 miniguns on there. He's just spraying the area like crazy. And Basketball, which is a Marine C-130, was dropping flares to light up the night sky. So it was a long, busy night.
You flew about 800 combat missions, is that right?
Hmm. Had 41 air medals, which represented each one represents about 20 combat missions.
Wow.
Uh, so 820 or so.
And then sometimes there would be emergency calls, right? So you write about an
Hmm.
instance where you say, you're not really sleeping, but you're kind of in that semi-sleep state, and a call comes in that, we need to send up a helo on an emergency basis. And I'm wondering how much time would pass if you're in your rack, but the message comes through, all right, we need an emergency flight. How much time would pass between you getting that message in your rack and getting into the air? How much time do you think would go by typically?
I think the mission that you're talking about was a recon emergency medevac, and we were providing gunships for that. And I think it was between 45 minutes an hour between when the driver woke me up and we were in the air going. So
Right.
that included briefing and getting to the squadron, briefing the flight, pre-flighting, and getting an airplane cranked up and going.
And some of the missions had to do with recon teams in Laos, is that right?
Yes, yes. We flew out of for those were most of them were flown out of Fubai. We would send a team up to Fubai and fly from there and uh, and take guys in. We generally provided gunships for that.
Right. You mentioned in your memoir at least a few times helos that are shot down, or something happens and the whole crew is lost. And I'm wondering, what's the psychological process that goes into absorbing that news that we've just lost a crew, um, at the same time knowing that you're gonna be on another mission in an hour, in two
Right.
hours, in 5 hours the next morning.
I
What is
think
the psychological process there?
I think those of us that came to Vietnam with a strong religious background uh, had a strong faith. I don't think that affected us as much as those who did not. Uh, I uh, a guy named Ralph Dimling came over on the same airplane I did about 2 weeks before we were supposed to go home. He got shot down and killed, and I really felt bad about it. We went out shooting, but they said, "Well, we've got to keep working. We don't have time. We have memorial services, uh, but we didn't have time to dwell on it. We had as many missions as we were flying, as many hours as we were flying. There wasn't much time to think about it. One of the missions that I remember most coming back, and I say it was a moment of stark terror, but when I look back on it, I really don't remember being scared, but it should have been.
Hmm.
Um, One mission, the crew chief and I are flying back. We dropped a general officer off in Chile. We're flying back about 3,000 feet, and we hear this smack. We know that it's a bullet hitting the airplane, but we don't know where. We check the gauges. All the engine instruments are good. We're not losing hydraulic fluid. The pressures are all good. Controls work fine. So we called back to the base and let them know we've been shot, but we didn't know what. Everything is working good. And so we'll just come on back to flight line, shut down, don't refuel. So we got back and shut down, and they're crawling around the airplane. Pretty soon, somebody brings a piece of metal, a small lump of lead, hands it to the maintenance officer that they'd scraped off the bottom of my armor plated seat.
Wow.
So that was an interesting time. Another time that one time that got me in trouble because I didn't ask for help when I should have, but I was out being chased by a frog, and um, I had 5 or 6 people on the airplane, and there was a group. But the frog had, I think 12 troops on his airplane, and we inserted them on near a bridge to go recover a body. and I'm making a low pass by that bridge, and some VC stood up behind an rusty old oil barrel that was back there and sprayed the aircraft. I had two or three people on the aircraft got wounded. And we got shot up, but we didn't get shot down. So I flew it back to the medical facility and dropped off all the wounded, and then flew back to the base. I'm making an approach to the beach at the 3MAF headquarters. As I'm down low over the water, some fisherman who damaged his nets could no longer fish with the nets, threw a piece of dynamite overboard to blow up some fish, and it blew up right underneath my aircraft, sprayed water all over it. So, it's one of those, what the heck was that thing? So they get your heart going a little bit.
Right. So you say that, at this moment, when, for example, when the Viet Cong sprays the Huey with gunfire, you should have been scared, but you weren't. But over months, is there a cumulative toll that this takes as you look back on it, let's say you're in month number 10, as you look back on it, can you see now that there was a cumulative toll of just the pace of operations, the number of operations, and the things that you're seeing each week, the medevacs and the combat and the other things that come with the struggle.
There had to be. I know I described in the book one series of things. I think it was around the end of April, first of maybe it was the end of March, first of April, where I had like 4 or 5 days of continuous missions. Had an overnight mission, come back the next morning, land the airplane, get out, climb in another airplane, go off and do something else. You know, after the first couple of weeks in Vietnam, I don't ever remember going to the mess hall, going to the club to eat. I think, we generally had a box of sea rations around there. We'd heat up some sea rations in our quarters when we got back. So I'm sure it was taking a toll on us, but I think aviation safety office, the folks, the training guys out in Monterey at Naval Postgraduate School, they talk about compartmentalization.
Mhm.
They say, as an aviator, to accomplish your mission, you've got to compartmentalize. You've got to set things aside in your mind and not think about them. And when you're flying, the only thing you're focused on is flying and doing what you have to do. Uh, I would assume that at some point exhaustion would set in. And I remember being tired when I got done, but I don't ever remember being tired while I was flying. I think just the adrenaline pumping from the excitement of the flight, the things that's going on, just it's a local drug.
Yeah.
It just keeps you pumped up. The last month and a half, 2 months that I was flying chase pilot for General McCutcheon, and I went out and flew with General Miller a lot, Brigadier General Miller, and we visited a lot of the projects that were going on. We saw villages being protected, fences being built so they could raise some crops and plant things. We saw schools being built, hospitals. There's reports that talks about hospitalizations and how many how many Vietnamese and wounded and injured and just sick were being treated in the hospitals, and hospitals are being built. Uh, Vietnamese doctors are being trained to work in the hospitals. And we were trying to do things to turn the country back over to the Vietnamese. The only thing we needed to do is keep the NVA and the VC out of it. VC, I don't think would have been a problem if the NVA weren't coming in and
Right.
causing so much trouble. And the NVA, of course, had a lot of support out of the Chinese and the Russians.
You mentioned that you say things about the crew chiefs. What do you have to say about the crew chiefs you served with?
They were mostly young men, either high school dropouts or fresh out of high school, who we could not have survived without them. They did the job. They worked 24 hours a day, keeping airplanes up and flying. We had tremendous availability for the aircraft because somebody was working on them 24 hours a day. Crew chiefs, I think half the crew chiefs slept in their airplane. They would do things to protect it. They would do things to make sure it was ready to go because they get paid a little extra for flying. They're a crew chief. They wanted to fly. They wanted their aircraft up and flying. People who were there talked about how important the helicopters were to them, either providing close air support for whatever they were doing, or bringing in food and water, bringing ammunition, and especially when they get in a firefight and need a medevac. Uh, we've proven over and over again since Korea just how important helicopters and vertical air transportation is in the field to get a guy back uh, to a hospital.